Hello. In this video, we'll be going through revenue recognition over a period of time. We've seen before that there are 5 principles that need to be applied in order to recognize revenue by a corporation. You have to identify the contract, identify the performance obligation, determine the transaction price, and then allocate the transaction price. And then lastly, you have to recognize the revenue when or as each performance obligation is satisfied. Item number 5 is easy to identify. When I go to a coffee shop and I go to Starbucks, I buy a coffee, right? And the Starbucks gives me the coffee, and so that's their performance obligation, and they can recognize the revenue at that point in time. But not all transactions are that simple. Some revenue is actually recognized over a period of time and not actually at one point of time. And there's 3 criteria that determines if revenue should be recognized over a period of time. And as long as a corporation falls under one of these criteria, then they know they have to recognize their revenue over a period of time. The first one is the customer consumes the benefit of the seller's work as it is being performed or as it is performed. The slide says examples of cleaning service. I think subscription services are easier to think about. I pay Netflix for 1 year up front. And so when I pay Netflix my 1 year dollar amount, they don't recognize that revenue at that point in time. They divide it by 12 and recognize 1/12 of that revenue over each month. So that's one way companies recognize revenue over a period of time. If the customer controls the asset as it is being created, so think of a company that constructs a building extension, and as the building is being extended, right, the extension is being built, the customer controls that portion of the building, and so therefore the seller is going to recognize the revenue from that contract over a period of time. Or if the seller is creating an asset that has no alternative use to the seller, and the seller has a legal right to receive payments for progress to date. So think of when an order of jets customized for the U.S. Air Force. I don't know if that's Boeing that makes them, whoever, but they have that asset. It really has no alternative use to, let's say it is Boeing, and they have a legal right to receive that payment. So in that situation, if it was Boeing, they would recognize the revenue over a period of time. So the revenue is recognized in proportion to the amount of performance obligation that has been satisfied. So my Netflix example, Netflix would recognize 1/12 of my annual payment as each month as they have provided the Netflix service to me as their customer. Let's take an example. TrueTech Industries sells 1-year subscriptions to the TriNet multi-user platform of internet-based games. TrueTech sells 1,000 subscriptions for $60 each on January 1, 2027. So when they receive that cash on 2027, they're going to debit cash for $60,000, right? The $60 times 1,000 subscriptions, and they haven't earned any of that revenue, right? They haven't actually provided that service of the platform of internet-based games. So they're going to credit a liability called deferred revenue for $60,000, and then they're going to recognize that liability over a 12-month period. So at the end of each of the 12 months following the sale, TrueTech would record the following entry to recognize the revenue. They would take the $60,000 divided by 12, right, because it's for 1 year, and they would debit deferred revenue by $5,000 each month, and then they would credit service revenue for $5,000 each month. So when we look at the T accounts for the deferred revenue, here's my initial entry on January 1, where we see the credit for the liability for $60,000. And then each month, at the end of each month of January 31 to 28, etc., they're going to debit that deferred revenue by $5,000. So at the end of the year, their liability is going to be zero. And then each month they recognize their $5,000 of service revenue. So at the end of the year, they recognize $60,000 of revenue on their income statement, which makes sense because by the end of the year, they have provided that service of the platform of internet-based games. So that's how they recognize it. You have to create a deferred revenue liability, and then as you're recognizing the revenue, you debit the deferred liability and credit the revenue account. Now, if a performance obligation, which is really what does the seller have to do in order to recognize that revenue? What performance do they need? Are they obligated to give to their customer? If the performance obligation does not meet any of the three criteria for recognizing revenue over time, then they have to recognize the revenue at the point in time when the performance obligation has been completely satisfied, which usually occurs at the end of the contract. So in the case of Starbucks selling a cup of coffee, the end of the contract is really when they give me my cup of coffee that I paid for. That's their end of their contract for the performance obligation. Think of also if you have a house painting service that provides that service or benefit to its customer as the work is being performed, it does meet the first criteria of recognizing revenue over time in that the customer is consuming the benefit of the seller's work as it is being performed. So let's just say the painting service says it's going to take us 2 weeks to paint your warehouse. And so I, as the owner of the warehouse, gives the painting service the money up front for that paint job. Well, that paint housing service, they're not going to start recognizing this money that they received up front over a 2-week period. It just doesn't really make sense. So in that situation, even though they are performing this their work over a period of time, they will just recognize this full money that they got up front for this paint job at the end of the paint job, which is the end of the contract. So let's do a concept check. Which of the following is an indicator that revenue for a service should be recognized over time? Let's go to A. The seller is enhancing an asset that the customer controls as the service is performed. Let's go to B. The seller is providing continuous effort to the customer. Well, continuous effort is really irrelevant. I mean, you can provide a lot of effort. It doesn't really matter. B is out. C is the seller can estimate the percent of work completed. We haven't talked anything about that. And D is the sales price is fixed and determinable. We haven't discussed any of that either. So the answer is A, and it's because the seller is enhancing an asset that the customer controls. And that's really the key word here, that the customer is control of the service or product, the service that's performed, the product that's being provided, because that's really what you need. That's criteria number criteria number 2, which we see right here in this slide, that the customer controls the asset as it is being created. And that's the answer that we see. The answer is A, the revenue is recognized over a period of time if the customer is controlling the asset as it is created.